At 3:17 in the morning, the security camera at Fort Bragg captured something that should not have been there. A thin layer of fog hung low over the perimeter fence, the kind of quiet Carolina night where even the wind seemed to hesitate before moving through the pine trees. The gate lights buzzed softly, casting pale circles on the empty asphalt, and for a moment everything looked exactly as it should, until the motion alert triggered without warning. The monitor in the guard station flickered, and there it was again, a figure standing just beyond the base entrance, still, patient, unmoving. A German shepherd. White coat. No collar tag visible. No handler in sight. Just presence. The guard on duty leaned closer to the screen, unsure if fatigue was playing tricks on him, but the system confirmed it again, unknown K9 detected. Outside, the dog did not pace or bark or retreat. It simply waited, as if it already knew it belonged there. Its fur reflected the floodlights in soft tones of silver and ivory, catching every shift of light, like memory, trying to surface through fog. Inside the command post, the radio crackled to life as protocol engaged, and within minutes, Fort Bragg shifted into quiet alert status. Doors locked. Access routes secured. A routine response. Yet something about this felt different, heavier in a way no one could immediately explain. Down the corridor, Sergeant Caleb Morgan had just stepped out of the barracks when his phone vibrated once, then again, sharper this time. The message was short. Report to gate perimeter immediately. Unidentified K9 present. Caleb did not respond right away. He just stared at the words, his grip tightening slightly around the edge of his phone, as if his body had recognized something before his mind had caught up. The air inside the hallway felt colder as he moved, boots steady against the polished concrete, every step measured, controlled, but not entirely calm. 3 years had passed since he had last stood in front of a K9 unit without thinking about what he lost, yet now that thought arrived uninvited, sharp and immediate. Outside, the wind shifted again, brushing across the fence line in a slow sweep that made the grass bend in waves. The white German shepherd remained exactly where it was, just beyond the threshold of light and shadow, watching the base with an intensity that felt almost deliberate. It did not react to the guard's movements or the distant sound of doors opening. It was focused on something deeper, something unseen, something remembered. A second patrol unit arrived, headlights cutting across the fog, but even then the animal did not move. It simply turned its head slightly, as if acknowledging a signal only it could hear. And then, from the far end of the corridor inside the base, Sergeant Caleb Morgan appeared at the edge of the floodlights. He stopped before anyone could speak. The air around him seemed to change, as though the night itself had tightened its grip. The white K9 shifted its stance for the first time, just slightly, just enough for recognition to begin forming in silence. No one spoke. No command was given. Yet in that suspended moment between caution and certainty, something long buried inside the base began to surface, something that would not fit into any report or protocol, something that had been gone for 3 years but had somehow found its way home again. Caleb Morgan stepped forward into the edge of the floodlights, and for a brief moment the entire perimeter seemed to lose its sense of routine. The air was sharp, carrying the faint metallic scent of dew settling on cold pavement, and every sound from the base appeared to lower itself instinctively, as if the night itself understood something important was happening. The white German shepherd remained still, but its posture had changed in a way no one on duty could ignore. It was no longer simply waiting. It was watching him with an attention that felt personal, anchored, and impossibly familiar. A young military police officer raised a hand slightly, signaling caution, reminding everyone that standard protocol required containment of unidentified assets. Yet Caleb did not slow down. His steps were steady, measured, almost reluctant, like a man approaching a memory he had once tried to bury. Behind him, radios continued to whisper procedural updates, but none of it felt relevant anymore. Frost, though unnamed to most in the present moment, shifted its weight just slightly forward, not aggressive, not defensive, but responsive, as if recognizing not just a person, but a presence it had been waiting years to confirm. Caleb stopped approximately 10 feet away, close enough for detail, far enough for restraint, and in that distance he saw everything he needed to see without yet touching anything. The dog's coat was cleaner than expected for something that had traveled unknown distances, yet there were subtle signs of a long journey, softened edges in the fur, a quiet fatigue in the eyes, and a stillness that spoke more of endurance than abandonment. One of the officers nearby whispered that the identification system still showed no registered chip or active military tag, and that uncertainty rippled through the group like a quiet current. A base commander arrived moments later, posture rigid, expression controlled, assessing the situation as a potential security anomaly. Yet even he paused when he noticed Caleb's reaction. It was not confusion on Caleb's face. It was recognition layered over disbelief, the kind that takes years to build and seconds to fracture. A memory surfaced in him without permission. Early morning drills under pale sun, the sound of boots against gravel, and a younger version of himself kneeling beside a white German shepherd that had refused to leave his side during training evaluation. That memory collided with the present so sharply that he almost missed the way Frost took a single step forward, slow and deliberate, closing the distance just slightly, as if testing whether time still mattered. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to hold itself back. Caleb lowered his hand instinctively, not as a command, but as an invitation he was not fully aware he was offering. The dog responded not with urgency, but with certainty, moving forward another step until the gap between them was no longer defined by protocol, but by something far older and deeper. The base commander signaled for restraint units to remain in position, but his tone had softened, uncertain now whether this situation belonged to security procedures or something else entirely. Frost's eyes remained locked on Caleb, unblinking, steady, and strangely calm, as though the years between them had not erased anything at all, only stretched it thin. Caleb finally exhaled, a slow release of breath he did not realize he had been holding. And in that moment the noise of the base, the radios, the footsteps, the distant hum of engines, all seemed to fade into something distant and unimportant. What remained was silence, not empty, but heavy with recognition. Frost lowered its head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, closing the final distance until the presence of years dissolved into proximity, and the impossible reality of return settled quietly between them without need for explanation. Caleb Morgan stood motionless as the distance between him and the white German shepherd disappeared into something that no longer felt physical. The floodlights above the gate cast a soft, pale glow over the scene, turning every breath of fog into a drifting veil of memory. Around them, the base remained in controlled alert, but the tension had shifted, no longer sharp or procedural, but uncertain in a quieter way, as if everyone present had realized they were witnessing something outside standard explanation. Frost took another small step forward and stopped just within arm's reach, its head slightly lowered, not in fear, but in recognition that carried weight beyond training or instinct. Caleb slowly extended his hand, not as a command, but as someone approaching a truth he was not fully prepared to confirm. The moment his fingers touched the top of Frost's head, a subtle release seemed to pass through both of them, like a lock finally giving way after years of pressure. The dog closed its eyes briefly, leaning into the contact with a calm that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty surrounding them. Behind Caleb, the base commander observed without interrupting, his expression shifting from authority to something closer to reflection, as though protocol had temporarily lost its language. One of the military police officers whispered that the identification scan still showed nothing in the system, but no one moved to escalate anymore. Instead, attention drifted toward Caleb and the dog, as if waiting for something only they could understand to surface. Caleb's hand remained steady on Frost's head, and slowly, fragments of memory returned with unsettling clarity. He saw training yards under early morning fog, saw Frost moving through obstacle courses with precise focus, saw long hours of conditioning where trust was built not through words, but repetition and presence. And then he saw the last mission, not in full detail, but in fragments that carried the weight of unfinished understanding. Radio static, shifting terrain, a sudden loss of contact, and Frost running ahead as if responding to something only it could sense. Caleb's breathing slowed as those memories overlapped with the present moment, where the same white coat now stood before him, real and unchanged in ways that defied explanation. Frost shifted slightly, turning its head toward Caleb's chest, where a faint metallic tag still hung from an old chain. The dog's nose moved closer to it, pausing as if detecting something buried beneath time itself. Caleb instinctively lowered his gaze, and for the first time he noticed what others had not yet fully processed. The collar around Frost's neck was not standard issue. It was worn, carefully maintained, but modified, as if it had been preserved rather than replaced. A small engraved plate caught the light, partially obscured by scratches, but still legible enough to draw attention. The base commander stepped forward slightly, asking for visual confirmation, and one of the officers adjusted a handheld light toward the collar. As the beam steadied, the engraving became clearer, and the surrounding air seemed to tighten in response. Caleb did not speak. His focus narrowed entirely on the message, his expression shifting from recognition into something deeper, something heavier. Frost remained still as the light touched the metal, unbothered, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment to be seen. Around them, the base felt suspended, every sound reduced to a distant hum. The message on the collar was not long, but it carried a weight that none of them were prepared to dismiss. Caleb's fingers tightened slightly against the fur at Frost's neck, not pulling, not restraining, but anchoring himself to what he was seeing. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the wind seemed to pause along the fence line. The presence of Frost no longer felt like an unknown return, but like a continuation of something unfinished, something that had simply waited long enough to be found again. Caleb finally exhaled, slow and uneven, as if acknowledging that the past 3 years had not erased anything at all, but only delayed a conversation that was now standing directly in front of him, patient and alive. The silence that followed the recognition between Caleb Morgan and the white German shepherd was not empty, but dense, as if the entire perimeter had been filled with something unspoken that no one wanted to disturb. The floodlights continued their steady hum above Fort Bragg's main gate, casting long pale streaks across the asphalt, while the morning fog began to thin just enough to reveal the distant outline of the base structures. Frost remained still, its head slightly lowered beneath Caleb's hand, as though accepting something that had been interrupted for far too long. Caleb's fingers did not move. He stayed grounded in that contact, feeling the subtle warmth of the animal beneath his palm, a warmth that contradicted everything logical about the situation. Behind them, the base commander had stepped closer, no longer observing from distance but engaging with caution, his voice controlled as he requested a full verification of the engraving on the collar. A tactical flashlight was raised again, and the beam sharpened the metallic surface until every scratch and worn edge became visible. The engraved message was not official military formatting, not a standard identification sequence, but something personal, compressed, and deliberately preserved. Caleb read it once without speaking, then again, slower, as if repetition might alter meaning. His expression shifted subtly, not into shock, but into recognition layered with something heavier, something closer to acceptance of an old truth resurfacing at the wrong time. Around them, the officers maintained position, but their posture had softened slightly, the urgency of containment replaced by curiosity that no protocol could fully suppress. One of the military police officers murmured that the collar design did not match any registered unit equipment, yet no one moved to intervene further. Frost remained calm, its breathing steady, eyes occasionally shifting between Caleb and the surrounding personnel, as if measuring reactions without judgment. Caleb finally lowered his hand from the dog's head, but Frost did not step away. Instead, it remained close, maintaining a quiet proximity that felt intentional rather than accidental. The base commander asked for confirmation again, this time with less authority in his tone and more uncertainty, and Caleb responded after a long pause, his voice controlled but distant, as if he was speaking from a place slightly removed from the present. He did not explain immediately. Instead, he reached for the collar with careful precision, turning it slightly to catch the light at a different angle. Beneath the engraved message, faint markings became visible, markings that suggested maintenance, preservation, and repeated handling over time. It was not abandonment. It was continuity. That realization altered the atmosphere again, subtly but unmistakably. Frost shifted its weight and exhaled slowly, lowering its head once more, pressing lightly against Caleb's arm in a gesture that required no interpretation. The gesture carried familiarity, not instruction. Caleb closed his eyes for a brief moment, and in that silence, fragments of memory aligned in a way that no longer felt fragmented. He remembered the last confirmed field communication involving Frost, the incomplete reports, the silence that followed, and the assumption that had been recorded but never truly resolved. Now, standing at the gate under controlled lights, that assumption no longer held. Something had continued beyond it. The base commander signaled for a temporary stand-down of escalation protocol, though his tone made it clear this was not resolution, only suspension. Frost remained at Caleb's side, unmoving, as if acknowledging that the moment required no further action. The surrounding personnel began to relax incrementally, though their attention remained fixed on the pair at the center of the gate. Caleb opened his eyes again and looked down at the collar one more time, his hand resting lightly near the engraved plate without touching it directly. The message was still there, unchanged, but its meaning had shifted in weight rather than form. What had once been classified as absence was now standing in front of him in silence. Frost turned its head slightly toward him again, and this time Caleb did not hesitate. He placed his hand once more on the dog's neck, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement that whatever had been lost had not disappeared. It had simply found its way back through time that no longer felt linear, only patient. The first light of morning had begun to stretch across Fort Bragg, softening the harsh lines of the floodlights that had dominated the gate only an hour earlier. Mist still clung to the edges of the perimeter fence, drifting low across the ground like a memory refusing to dissolve. Frost remained beside Caleb Morgan, unmoving except for the subtle rhythm of its breathing, as if the passage of time itself had slowed around them. The base commander had ordered a temporary suspension of all non-essential movement in the immediate area, not as containment, but as precaution, though no one could clearly define what they were being cautious of anymore. Caleb stood with one hand resting lightly on the German shepherd's neck, the other hanging still at his side, his posture steady but inwardly distant. The engraved collar remained visible under the softening light, its message unchanged yet heavier now that it had been acknowledged by multiple eyes. Around them, personnel maintained respectful distance, their earlier urgency replaced by a quiet restraint that came from uncertainty rather than command. Frost finally shifted its position slightly, turning its head toward the base entrance, then back toward Caleb, as if waiting for a decision that had nothing to do with protocol. Caleb followed the movement with his eyes and exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried more memory than air. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he lowered himself into a kneeling position beside the dog, bringing himself level with it, a gesture that removed hierarchy from the moment entirely. The contact between them remained steady, grounded, almost familiar in a way that no one else present could fully interpret. A nearby officer quietly noted that the dog's behavior did not match any known stray classification or military abandonment pattern, but the comment faded into the background as attention continued to center on Caleb and Frost. The base commander approached one step closer, this time without interruption, and asked Caleb if he could confirm whether he recognized the message in full context. Caleb hesitated for a long moment before responding, his voice calm but weighted, as though each word required permission from memory itself. He did not reveal everything at once. Instead, he spoke in fragments, referencing a unit designation, a field assignment, and a mission window that had ended without closure. As he spoke, Frost remained still, occasionally shifting its gaze toward Caleb's face, reacting not to words but to tone, to presence, to something deeper than language. The surrounding personnel remained silent, absorbing the exchange without interference. The early morning light continued to strengthen, revealing more detail in the dog's coat, which reflected soft shades of white and pale gold, unmarked but weathered by time and distance. Caleb's hand moved again, this time resting more firmly on the collar, tracing the engraved line with deliberate care. He paused when he reached the final segment of the message, as if that portion carried the most weight. For a moment, he closed his eyes again, and in that brief silence, the memory returned with greater clarity than before. He saw coordination signals, incomplete extraction logs, and the moment communication had gone silent during an operation that had never received a formal resolution. What stood out now was not what had been lost, but what had not been recorded afterward. Frost suddenly leaned slightly closer to him, pressing its shoulder gently against his arm, a movement that interrupted the spiral of thought and returned him fully to the present. Caleb opened his eyes and acknowledged the gesture without hesitation. The connection between them no longer felt like uncertainty seeking confirmation, but like recognition finally settling into form. Around them, the base remained still, waiting not for action, but for understanding that had not yet been fully spoken. Caleb looked once more at Frost, then toward the gate, then back again, as if aligning past and present within the same frame. Nothing about the moment resolved into clarity for anyone observing from the outside, yet within the silence between man and dog, something had already been answered without words. The morning at Fort Bragg had fully shifted into a controlled calm, where the earlier tension at the gate now felt like a distant echo rather than an active crisis. The floodlights had been powered down to half intensity, leaving the perimeter bathed in a softer, more natural daylight that revealed details the artificial glow had previously washed away. Frost remained close to Caleb Morgan, standing in a steady, grounded posture that suggested neither fear nor confusion, but something closer to resolution. The German shepherd's breathing was even, slow, and deliberate, as if it had finally arrived at a place it recognized after a journey that spanned years rather than miles. Caleb stood beside it, no longer rigid, his shoulders slightly lowered, as though the weight he had been carrying since the first moment of recognition had begun to redistribute into something more manageable. The base commander had stepped back half a pace, observing not with command authority, but with a measured silence that came from acknowledging that this situation no longer fit within standard operational categories. The engraved collar remained the focal point of attention, not because it demanded it, but because everything else seemed to orbit around it without resistance. Caleb finally spoke again, his voice lower than before, steady but marked with the quiet strain of memory. He explained that the designation etched into the collar corresponded to a field operation that had gone dark without formal closure, an operation that had left behind fragments of documentation but no confirmed outcome. As he spoke, Frost subtly shifted closer, pressing its shoulder lightly against his leg, a gesture that interrupted the boundary between recollection and present reality. No one interrupted him. Even the nearby officers, who had initially approached with procedural caution, now listened with the stillness of individuals realizing that they were not witnessing a standard recovery, but something that had unfolded beyond official record-keeping. Caleb described fragments of that final deployment, not in detail that constructed narrative, but in broken pieces that carried emotional weight rather than tactical clarity. He spoke of coordination that had suddenly ceased, of tracking signals that had dissolved without explanation, and of the assumption that had been recorded in reports but never fully verified through return or confirmation. Each word he spoke seemed to settle into the air differently, as if the environment itself was absorbing it. Frost remained attentive throughout, occasionally lifting its head when Caleb paused, as though recognizing pauses in memory as much as spoken language. The base commander eventually requested a formal pause in external communications regarding the situation, not to suppress information, but to prevent premature classification until a full assessment could be completed. The request was acknowledged, but it did not alter the atmosphere. What had begun as a security alert had transitioned into something more reflective, something that required interpretation rather than intervention. Caleb knelt again briefly, placing both hands near Frost's collar, not adjusting it, but steadying it as if confirming its presence was real and not symbolic. The engraved message, now fully visible in daylight, no longer felt like an anomaly. It felt like a continuation of a line that had never truly been broken. Frost responded by lowering its head slightly, resting it against Caleb's forearm, holding that position with quiet certainty. Around them, personnel began to disperse into lower readiness, though most remained within sight, drawn not by duty but by curiosity that had shifted into respect. Caleb remained in place for several moments longer, then slowly rose, keeping his hand on Frost as it rose with him. The movement was synchronized, not trained, but familiar in a way that suggested time had not erased connection, only paused it. The wind moved gently through the base perimeter, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and early morning light. And for the first time since the initial alert, the entire scene felt less like an incident and more like a return that had taken too long to complete. The atmosphere inside Fort Bragg had shifted again, not in urgency, but in understanding, as if the base itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Morning light now stretched fully across the concrete pathways, softening the sharp geometry of the installation and revealing a calm that contrasted deeply with the earlier tension at the gate. Frost remained beside Caleb Morgan as he walked slowly away from the perimeter, not restrained, not guided, but moving in parallel as though their alignment had never been interrupted. The German shepherd's steps were steady, deliberate, each one matching Caleb's pace with a familiarity that required no instruction. Behind them, the base commander followed at a respectful distance, no longer issuing directives, but instead observing with the quiet focus of someone adjusting their understanding of what had just occurred. Other personnel had resumed minimal movement, though none of it felt routine anymore. Conversations were subdued, radios carried fewer updates, and even the mechanical sounds of the base seemed less intrusive, as if everything had recalibrated around the presence that had returned. Caleb did not speak for several minutes. His attention remained forward, but his awareness stayed anchored to Frost, occasionally glancing down as the dog stayed close at his side. The engraved collar, still visible, no longer functioned as a mystery to be solved, but as a marker of continuity that no longer required external validation. Eventually, they reached a quieter section near the side administrative building where the wind was less intense and the sound of distant activity faded into a low hum. It was there that Caleb finally stopped walking. Frost stopped with him instantly, turning its head slightly upward as if awaiting instruction that never came. Caleb knelt once more, not out of necessity, but out of habit formed in years when communication between man and K9 was built on proximity rather than words. He placed one hand gently along the side of Frost's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of life beneath the coat that had weathered more time than records could fully account for. The base commander arrived a moment later, maintaining a respectful distance, and asked Caleb if he was prepared to submit a formal debrief for archival review. Caleb paused before responding, not because he lacked information, but because the answer required him to reconcile memory with reality. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, but layered with something reflective. He confirmed that the identification etched into the collar corresponded to a unit protocol that had never been officially closed, and that Frost had been part of a deployment sequence that ended without resolution or recovery confirmation. As he spoke, Frost remained still, occasionally shifting its gaze between Caleb and the surrounding environment, but never showing signs of distress or uncertainty. It was as if the dog had already accepted everything being said long before it was verbalized. The base commander listened without interruption, his expression now fully removed from procedural authority and instead shaped by acknowledgement of something that extended beyond standard military categorization. A light breeze moved through the corridor between buildings, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant fuel operations, grounding the moment in physical reality even as its meaning continued to feel larger than what could be contained within official language. Caleb finished speaking and allowed silence to return, but it was no longer the same silence that had existed at the gate. This one felt settled, as if pieces that had been separated for years had finally aligned without resistance. Frost leaned slightly closer again, resting its weight lightly against Caleb's leg, maintaining contact as though confirming that the connection between them required no further proof. Caleb did not move away. Instead, he stayed still, allowing the presence to remain uninterrupted. Around them, the base continued its slow return to normal function, but nothing about it felt exactly the same as before. The return that had begun as an anomaly had now become something quieter, something that did not demand explanation, only acknowledgement, and within that acknowledgement, both man and dog remained together, no longer separated by absence, but joined by the simple fact of being found. The late morning sun over Fort Bragg had fully broken through the last remnants of fog, casting a steady golden light across the base that now felt quieter, almost reflective, as if the entire installation had entered a state of collective pause. Frost remained beside Caleb Morgan, no longer a subject of uncertainty or procedural attention, but a presence that had settled into something approaching belonging. The German shepherd moved with him as he walked slowly along the side corridor near the administrative wing, each step measured not by command, but by mutual rhythm that required no reinforcement. The base commander followed at a respectful distance, his earlier caution replaced by a more contemplative posture, as though he had moved from enforcement into observation of something that could not be contained by regulation. Around them, personnel resumed normal duties, but their glances lingered longer than usual whenever Caleb and Frost passed by, as if confirming repeatedly that what they had witnessed earlier had not been a temporary anomaly. Caleb finally came to a stop near a quiet section of the courtyard where the sound of distant operations softened into a low background hum. Frost stopped immediately as well, positioning itself close to Caleb's side without hesitation. There was no command given, no signal exchanged, yet the synchronization between them remained precise and natural. Caleb looked down at the German shepherd for a long moment, his expression no longer strained by confusion or urgency, but shaped instead by something closer to acceptance. The engraved collar had been verified multiple times by now, its message recorded, photographed, and reviewed by base intelligence personnel, yet its significance extended far beyond documentation. It represented continuity where there had once been silence, and presence where there had been absence recorded for years. The base commander stepped forward slightly and asked Caleb if he intended to initiate formal reinstatement procedures for the animal under military classification review. Caleb did not answer immediately. Instead, he knelt slowly beside Frost, placing one hand along its neck, feeling the steady and familiar warmth beneath his palm. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and deliberate, acknowledging that while official records had marked the unit as unresolved, what stood before them now could not be dismissed as unresolved identity. Frost responded by leaning gently into his arm, maintaining contact as if reinforcing the statement without needing language. The surrounding personnel remained silent, their attention fixed on the interaction, yet the intensity of observation had softened into something closer to respect. The base commander nodded slightly, signaling acknowledgement of Caleb's position, though no final administrative decision was made in that moment. Instead, what emerged was a shared understanding that this situation existed outside the boundaries of immediate classification. Caleb stood again slowly, and Frost rose with him in perfect alignment, matching his movement without hesitation or delay. They began walking together once more, moving away from the central courtyard toward a quieter section of the base, where morning activity continued at a distance. The wind moved lightly across the open space, carrying with it the faint sound of flags shifting above nearby buildings and the steady rhythm of routine operations returning in the background. Yet despite the return of normal activity, nothing about the moment felt ordinary. Caleb occasionally glanced down at Frost as they walked, and each time the dog looked back briefly, maintaining that steady connection that required no confirmation. The engraved message on the collar, now securely documented within base records, no longer functioned as a mystery to be solved, but as a marker of endurance through time that had not erased connection. As they reached the edge of the administrative pathway, Caleb slowed once more, and Frost matched his pace exactly before coming to a complete stop beside him. There was no need for instruction, no expectation of action, only the quiet acknowledgement that whatever had been separated by years had returned not through explanation, but through presence. Around them, Fort Bragg continued its operations under a clear morning sky, yet at that moment, within the stillness shared between man and dog, everything else seemed briefly distant, as if the world had narrowed itself to the simple fact that some bonds do not end, they only wait. The afternoon light over Fort Bragg had shifted into a warmer, steadier tone, casting long shadows across the base pathways as the day continued its quiet return to normal operations. Yet nothing about the atmosphere felt entirely ordinary anymore. Somewhere beneath the surface of routine activity, a subtle awareness remained, centered around the presence of Caleb Morgan and the white German shepherd that now walked beside him, as if no time had ever separated them. Frost moved with calm precision. Its steps aligned naturally with Caleb's pace, neither ahead nor behind, but perfectly matched in a rhythm that felt less like coordination and more like memory resurfacing. They had returned to the quieter section near the administrative wing, where the noise of vehicles and distant drills faded into a low ambient hum. Caleb finally stopped walking, and Frost stopped instantly with him, lowering its head slightly, as if acknowledging the pause was intentional. Caleb looked down at the dog for a long moment, his expression no longer searching for answers, but settling into something deeper, something that resembled understanding shaped by time rather than explanation. The base commander stood several feet away, no longer maintaining formal posture, instead observing with a calm stillness that suggested acceptance of a situation that could not be categorized through standard military structure. No further questions were asked. No additional verification was requested. The engraved collar had already been processed through internal review channels, yet its meaning remained something that could not be contained within any report. Caleb slowly knelt once more beside Frost, placing one hand gently along its neck, feeling the steady presence that had once been absent from his life without explanation. Frost responded by leaning closer, resting its head lightly against Caleb's arm, maintaining contact without hesitation or uncertainty. The moment carried no urgency, only continuity, as if everything that had been broken in time had simply resumed its position without forcing closure. Around them, personnel moved in the distance, but their attention remained drawn toward the stillness at the center of the courtyard. Conversations were minimal, replaced by quiet observation, as if everyone instinctively understood that what they were witnessing was not an event requiring action, but a return requiring acknowledgement. Caleb finally spoke again, but this time his voice carried no tension. He did not repeat what had already been confirmed, nor did he attempt to redefine what remained unresolved in official terms. Instead, he spoke briefly about continuity, about the way certain bonds formed in service do not follow the same structure as documented assignments or recorded outcomes. Frost remained still throughout, only shifting slightly when Caleb paused, as if responding to emotional rhythm rather than spoken language. The base commander eventually stepped closer, stopping at a respectful distance, and gave a simple nod that signaled closure of immediate procedural oversight without further intervention. No one attempted to rename or reclassify the situation further. It was accepted, quietly and without announcement, that some matters exist beyond immediate resolution. Caleb stood slowly, and Frost rose with him at the same pace, maintaining alignment without hesitation. They began walking together once more, moving through the open pathway where sunlight now fully covered the ground, softening the edges of the base structures. Around them, as they moved, Frost occasionally glanced up at Caleb, and each time Caleb returned the look without words, acknowledging presence without need for confirmation. The engraved collar remained visible, no longer as a point of investigation, but as a reminder that what had once been recorded as absence had instead continued in ways that records could not fully capture. When they reached the far edge of the courtyard, Caleb stopped for a final time, and Frost stopped with him, standing close without touching, simply existing beside him as if it had always belonged there. The wind moved gently across the base, carrying distant sounds of activity and routine operations, yet none of it disrupted the stillness between them. Caleb placed one final hand on Frost's neck, steady and calm, and remained there for several seconds without movement. In that final silence, nothing more needed to be said, because what had been lost had already returned, not as explanation, but as presence that no passage of time had been able to erase.